Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Cecilie Traberg. She's a psychology PhD candidate in the Social Decision Making Lab at the University of Cambridge, where her work seeks to bridge the fields of social influence and cognitive science. Broadly speaking, her research focuses on how groups act as sources of influence on our judgments and beliefs, including how intergroup biases impact our ability to assess the veracity of information and how social cues and interactions with other people affect individual level cognition. And today we're focusing mostly on misinformation. So, Cecilia, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
I've already had a few interviews on misinformation on the show, in fact, but let's go through this again because when we talk about misinformation, different people have somewhat different understandings of what it means exactly. So, what is misinformation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And as you noted, different researchers define it in different ways. So I think a quite predominant definition in the field is to define it according to the source or using source-based definitions. So defining fake news as, news coming from fictitious or made-up sources, and defining kind of true news as news coming from real mainstream popular sources. But I take a slightly different approach, given that news doesn't need to be completely false to be misleading. I and researchers in our lab define it instead according to whether or not the content itself makes use of misleading or deceptive strategies such as emotionally manipulative rhetorics or presenting false dichotomies. So using a more kind of content-based definition. And, misinformation is a term that's used quite broadly to cover even sometimes things that I wouldn't define as misinformation because misinformation can also be spread by accident. But sometimes we use it to also describe information that is spread intentionally, which some researchers would instead define as disinformation.
So intentionality matters here, but then probably some people would use more the word disinformation instead of misinformation, even though disinformation is like a subset of misinformation, right?
Yeah, so you could say that, misinformation is kind of any false information or information that turns out to be false. Sometimes journalists might publish something where they have maybe misinterpreted a scientific study, but they're not intending to mislead their audience. Then they will later retract the article, but then this would be misinformation. If there was an individual looking to actually kind of sway people's opinions and mislead, then we would call it disinformation. And then finally, propaganda is disinformation with a specific political agenda. So, with disinformation, you can have any form of agenda. You can also have a financial agenda or a social agenda, but with propaganda specifically, it is political. So intentionality does matter. However, when we look at whether or not people believe it, we kind of see similar effects across the board, whether it's, intentional or not.
So I would like to ask you now about a couple of phenomena, I guess, related to misinformation. Actually, even though I've already had several conversations with people on the show about the topic of misinformation, I don't remember asking anyone about this yet, so this is very interesting. What is perceived source similarity and perceived source credibility, and how do they relate to misinformation?
Sure. So I'll start with perceived source similarity. So perceived source similarity can be many different things, and we say perceived because it kind of depends on the individual and how they perceive the source to be. So source similarity is essentially when you are presented with information from kind of a message sender. This could be a news source. It could also be a Facebook friend sharing something. It could be an organization sharing something. We kind of use a series of heuristics to assess whether or not we think the source is similar to us. And this similarity can be a multitude of things. It can be, whether we perceive them to have the same political ideology as us. It can even be something as simple as whether or not they kind of look like us. It can be whether we think they have the same attitudes as us towards like a very specific topic, or whether we share the same background. There's various different types of similarity we can perceive, and we often pick up on these very quickly when we are exposed to a source. So in my work, I look a lot at political similarity or perceived political similarity. So when we look at a source, we kind of assess whether or not we think the source has a political ideology to us, and we do this with both organizational and individual sources. So for example, in one of my papers, we assessed whether conservatives and liberals in the US judge different organizational sources in different ways. And when we look at how they perceive the slant of those sources, we find that liberals perceive a lot of conservative sources as highly conservatively slanted, whereas they kind of perceive liberal sources as neutral, and vice versa for conservatives. But we do have a very kind of quick judgment of whether or not we think the source is politically similar to us. Perceived source credibility is different but related. So that is, built on whether or not we think the source is kind of is both trustworthy and is, competent in giving us the information that we seek from that source. So this kind of makes up the credibility. So if we think the source is credible, again, it's perceived credibility because credibility is subjective. There's also objective levels of credibility, of course, but we do also find in our work that people have highly different perceptions of different sources' credibility. And these two are linked. So source similarity is very linked to source credibility. So if we perceive a source to be similar to us, this also contributes to our perceptions of its credibility, which is important when we look at misinformation, because people use credibility to assess information from news sources.
And so, about perceived source credibility, does it have an effect on misinformation susceptibility?
Yeah, so essentially you could say that if we kind of objectively look at source credibility, so, some sources, especially, a lot of mainstream news sources that follow strict ethical journalistic practices of accuracy and research, and these sources are, higher on objective credibility than some individuals sitting in their bedroom creating kind of a fictitious news site. So there are some measures of objective credibility, but in terms of perceived credibility, the more credible we perceive a source to be, the more likely we are to believe misinformation from those sources. This is important both in terms of looking at, fictitious sources, but also mainstream sources, because just because a source is, popular does not mean it doesn't sometimes publish misleading content. And because we know that perceived credibility affects misinformation susceptibility, this means that if we are exposed to, a source that we perceive to be credible, and that source publishes misleading content, we are more likely to believe it. You could say that this is actually a good thing, because we should use our perceptions and evaluations of a source's credibility to judge whether or not we think it's, publishing true information. The problem is our perceptions can be biased, and news sources and fake news producers are getting much better at kind of mimicking credible looking sources. So yeah, it's not always a reliable measure, but it's one of the best ones we have, if you could put it like that.
And so, do we know if this affects liberals and conservatives equally?
So, in a way, yes, in a way, no. So, if we look at conservatives and liberals, they both pay attention to whether or not they perceive the source to be credible when judging whether the information is true or false. In fact, liberals maybe use it slightly more. They are kind of better at evaluating the source's credibility in general when it comes to judging the information. However, conservatives tend to be more likely to fall for misinformation in general. And we do also find that when liberals and conservatives evaluate the credibility of sources, even though liberals rely more on credibility evaluations, in general, when we look at news sources and which kind of sides of the spectrum are more likely to publish misinformation, then that is in fact conservative news outlets that are kind of slightly more likely to. And so this means that even though liberals rely more on perceived source credibility, conservatives will actually be more likely to fall for misinformation because there is just more of it on the conservative side.
Mm-hmm. And by conservative outlets, just to be a little bit more clear, you are referring to both mainstream media and alternative media, or just mainstream media?
Both. So while mainstream conservative media sites publish less misinformation than, very, very political and alternative news outlets, they do publish more misinformation than mainstream liberal outlets. So if we, for example, compare something like CNN and Fox News, a PolitiFact rating found that it was up to 58% of news published by Fox that turned out to be either false or mostly false. But this was around 10 years ago, but I think it's up there still, with the same number being in the around 20% for CNN. So this means, both sides of the spectrum can sometimes say things that turn out to be false later on, but it just happens more on the conservative side. If we look at something like, Breitbart instead, that number is going to be higher. Yeah.
But I mean, when it comes to this slight difference between liberals and conservatives, when it comes to publishing more misinformation and having a slightly higher tendency to believe in misinformation, do we know exactly what aspects of psychology explain that? I mean, are there any specific differences, psychological differences between liberals and conservatives that would contribute to that?
You mean kind of what drives the difference in their susceptibility on a psychological level?
Yes.
So one of them is definitely that that conservative news outlets just publish more misinformation. I'm not sure like what on a psychological level that actually drives this the difference, other than kind of the news outlets difference. Yeah, it could also be that some research shows that conservatives are slightly higher on motivated reasoning than liberals. And so this means that when we kind of like, if we kind of pretended that liberal outlets and conservative outlets spread the same amount of misinformation, then when conservatives read things that are kind of in line with their political beliefs, they are slightly more likely to interpret it in line with what they kind of already believe, um, than liberal. But I do think it's mainly driven by the news outlets themselves.
And you mentioned motivated reasoning there. So, in general, what is the role played by motivated cognition here?
So, motivated reasoning or motivated cognition is kind of our tendency to evaluate information based on whether or not it kind of fits with our pre-existing worldview. So, it's a form of bias. Um, And it means that, we kind of really like, and our brains really like information that already confirms our pre-existing beliefs, because it allows us to hold the same opinions and judgments about the world. So it's kind of, there's no cognitive dissonance there. So that definitely plays a role in how we evaluate information online. It's of course not the only thing. It just means that when we are exposed to cues on the internet, if the evidence or the article headline kind of says something that we like or that fits with our worldviews, we might also then in turn interpret the social cues surrounding it as like evidence that this is true. For example, if I see a headline that fits with my worldview, and I see that it has, let's say, a lot of likes, a lot of shares, a lot of, engagement, then I will kind of interpret this as, everyone agrees with me. If I, for example, see a headline that kind of disagrees with my worldview and, see lots of likes and lots of engagement, then I might instead interpret the engagement as, other people just, misunderstanding the headline or being, you know, let's say like less intelligent and less able to kind of properly evaluate the headline. So we also interpret the evidence differently depending on whether it kind of confirms our views.
Yeah, I don't like motivated cognition at all, but I really love when news confirm my biases and pre-existing
Yeah.
beliefs.
Yeah, it makes it kind of easier to be in the world when we see things that kind of yeah, because it allows us to kind of have a more smooth experience of news consumption as well. It's
Yeah.
only really when things stand out and we're like, hold on, that's not true, that we kind of stop, and need to process it a bit more.
Yeah, it takes more work to do that.
Hmm.
So, and what do you make of inattention accounts of the sharing of fake news? And what is that really about?
Yeah, so with the inattention accounts essentially suggest that the reason we believe misinformation or the reason we share fake news online is because we're simply not paying attention to accuracy. We're simply just not evaluating whether or not, or thinking about whether or not the headlines are accurate. So we're just not paying attention. There's like quite a famous paper called "Lazy Not Biased." We're just lazy. That's why we share misinformation. So, and a big Nature study was also published on this 2 years ago, finding that if people are simply, reminded to be accurate online, reminded like, hey, are you thinking about accuracy? Then this will lower their intentions to share misinformation online. So I do think that there is, some evidence that this plays a role, but I definitely don't think it tells the whole story. So, for example, um, reanalyzing the data from the big Nature paper from a few years ago, my colleagues and I found that um, if we kind of separated liberals and conservatives, these accuracy nudges or reminders to be accurate didn't work for conservatives. And conservatives, as we just discussed, are the main sharers of misinformation. So then do these nudges then really work? Um, so we were a little bit kind of skeptical about that. There's also a recent paper that came out this year that also challenged that account, the inattention account, suggesting that, actually 40% of people who, or that was kind of their number, 40% of people who were sharing fake news online, or sorry, 40% of what was shared of fake news online was shared by only 15% of kind of the users. So it's like a small proportion responsible for a big amount. And they were also finding that the people who were sharing this, they were kind of sharing a lot in general. So they were both sharing things that were fake, that were, attacking opponents, but also things that were fake, that were kind of going against their own political beliefs. So they were just sharing more information in general. So it wasn't necessarily, so they also challenged the inattention account, because in their study, perceptions of accuracy didn't really matter. And finally, there was also another study from 2016 that looked at, that basically asked people to rate a series of reasons for why they share information in general on the internet, on social media. And a lot of the reasons that people indicated were more social reasons. So wanting to share things that grabbed other people's attention. And that's also what the 2023 paper found, that people basically want to share things that are gonna get them engagement rather than, necessarily, accurate content in general. And on this list of why people wanted to share information, accuracy, out of like 30 measures, accuracy was one of the last 3. So people aren't necessarily, wanting to share things because they're accurate. That being said, of course, there is evidence that, we probably should remind people of accuracy to get those people who aren't just thinking about it. But yes, I don't think it's the whole story. And I'm also slightly skeptical as to whether this would actually work in the real world, when, everything is put within a social context and there are a lot more reasons than just, accuracy, motivations.
Yeah, there's something there that you touched on slightly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because most of the conversations I've had on the show about misinformation are actually from around 2 years ago, and so some of the information might be a bit outdated, but if it's still right, I guess that we also have to keep in mind that most of the misinformation that circulates online, for example, is produced by a very tiny number of people and is also actually shared by a small percentage of people,
Mm-hmm.
and is engaged by a small percentage of people usually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. I do think, however, that any amount of misinformation in our newsfeed can still, affect us, even if it's like a very, very, very small percentage of our news diets. Then, even a little bit can cause a lot of harm, both in terms of, affecting our behavior and our worldviews in general.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I guess that the reason why I'm mentioning this is because many people nowadays, because of narrative surrounding a supposed post-truth era and stuff like that, they think that suddenly like 90% of news they see is fake news, and it's not at all. And people think that we are like on the brink of the total collapse of
Mm-hmm.
truth, and you have to doubt everything you see online or on the news, but that's actually not true, right?
Yeah, so it's definitely not true, like to the extent that you're describing it there. Um, yeah, so I think that's also the danger of always talking about post-truth era, is that, there are people who will kind of spin that to become a form of misinformation in order to say that, now we can't trust anyone. And that's also, the fine line that I want to draw in my work, is that, I want people to be more aware of their, biases when it comes to evaluating, the credibility of sources. But I don't think we should stop actually evaluating the credibility of sources, because mainstream sources are still more reliable than than alternative news sources. And it is not the case that most mainstream news sources are trying to mislead us. And fake news is not news that, kind of isn't in line with our political opinions. We can't just call everything we don't like
Yeah.
fake news. And that's really harmful to kind of our real study of misinformation.
No, actually, I really love having these kinds of conversations on the show about misinformation because there's actually misinformation about misinformation out there, about
Yeah.
how misinformation works and how it disseminates and all of that. Because some people, even some science communicators themselves, have this very simplistic idea that people in general just believe in anything they see anywhere, and that's
Hmm.
not true. And also it's very important to understand some of the psychological motivations, and particularly their political and social motivations, to understand how misinformation really works. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And it was also, if we look back to when, the term fake news became really popular, it was in 2016 when Trump was calling everything fake news and the fake news media, etc. So that is kind of what kind of spiraled the term fake news to become so popular. But of course now, or also hopefully then, we knew that fake news is just not, the media in general.
Right. So let's talk now about interventions to try to reduce people's susceptibility to fake news. Because I guess that one thing that is very important here is to accurately measure that reduction in susceptibility to fake news. So, how is it measured? I mean, when you try an intervention, how do you measure how much effect it has on people's susceptibility to fake news? And what would you say are perhaps some of the possible limitations of these measurements?
So I think in general we can say that there's kind of two schools of thought when it comes to how we measure misinformation susceptibility.
Yep.
So uh, in our lab we mainly look at whether people are persuaded to believe information that is unreliable is in fact reliable. So we show them a series of headlines and ask them to rate the reliability, often on a scale from 1 to 7. So how reliable is this information? We use a very kind of, I guess, vague term, or it's not, that specific. We don't define it for people because we want their very kind of blunt observations. We just want them to think for a second about the reliability and assess it, not tell them how they should assess it, because we're not intending to motivate them to assess it in a certain way. Sometimes we ask them to rate their perceived accuracy, but it's always this, perceived level. Other researchers use truth discernment. So that's looking at whether or how good people are at discerning between what's real and false. So that will often be, a, a, a subtraction between their judgments of real news and their judgments of fake news to see how good people are at discerning. I think the problem with that measure is that it often doesn't capture anything, or doesn't capture everything, because it kind of hides things within the measure. So often, when we can say that if we say that people improved their truth discernment, often what those interventions are doing is not reducing their susceptibility to misinformation, but is increasing their judgments of reliable or truthful information. So they're not, judging fake news as less true. They're just judging true news as more true, which is also a positive outcome, but we're just not moving the fake news measure, which is often what we're intending to do. So it can kind of hide things within. So I do believe the misinformation, perceived reliability of fake news is a kind of more accurate measure when it comes to testing interventions. If our goal is to reduce misinformation susceptibility and not just kind of boost credible judgments of true news. Of course, that's also a positive outcome, but I do think we need to separate the two so that we can properly see what's going on.
And so there are debunking and prebunking approaches. Could you tell us about each of them, and do we know at this point which of them works best?
Hmm. Yeah, of course. So debunking and prebunking just means whether or not we're doing it before people are exposed to fake news or after. So debunking, could be anything from like fact checking or credibility ratings. You might be exposed to a headline, and then it might have like a caption on it, from the social media site that says, this content has been, rated as being not credible. Make sure you think about this when you look at it. Or it could be, fact checking websites that actually, rate information. It could also be let's say a news site that has published something unintentionally false, who then later issue a retraction and kind of debunk their own claim. But the problem with these things is, firstly, if we, for example, take the last example, not everyone who saw the original article is going to see the kind of the retraction. So retractions don't often work. Both because people don't always see them, but also even when they see them, they might not process it as deeply as when they first saw the article. So, for example, let's say you see a headline that says, vitamin supplements cause cancer or something like this, and then you think, oh my God, that this like shocks my worldview, and so you kind of layer it a bit deeper because it's that much more shocking. When you then later see a retraction, it might only kind of reduce kind of your belief in the original headline a little bit, but you still maintain like a little grain of truth in your brain. And in general, when we look at whether or not debunking works overall, and there's also the continued influence effect, which suggests that information continues to impact our reasoning even after it's been formally retracted. There's also something called the sleeper effect, which is a little bit less well studied, but it basically suggests that as the message gets separated from the source, like even if we see a headline that says something and we see the source and we think, oh, that source isn't reliable, then later on we kind of might forget what the source was and that the source was unreliable, but we just remember the headline. For example, if we think about many common misconceptions, you might have heard like the saying that you can see the Great Wall of China from the moon. Many people just think that you can, because we've heard it, but no one remembers who told them that. We just remember that, but that's actually not true. But most people can't say who they heard it from. If we then look at prebunking, this is a lot more effective because we're kind of catching people before they are exposed. And prebunking can, be a variety of things. Accuracy nudges could also be a form of prebunking if it's done, before people are exposed to the headline. It can be done both post and pre and post. But a lot of our work looks at inoculation theory, as you probably know, looking at whether we can preliminarily psychologically vaccinate people against misinformation before they are exposed to it and before kind of misinformation infiltrates their minds, if you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, about debunking, there are certain things that tend to annoy me a bit because, for example, as in many other countries now, here in Portugal, we also have on the news small segments of fact checking where the journalists pick perhaps some post on Facebook or in any other kind of social media that makes a claim, and then they go and check if it's actually true or not. They check the facts, but I guess that for some people who are not very politically motivated, that might work, but also if you go on the comment section of those fact-checking segments, I mean, if the piece of misinformation has anything to do, particularly with some political figure or political party, people who are affiliated with it or sympathize with it, you are not convincing them of anything
Yeah.
because they've already saw it. And I mean, in their minds, particularly if it comes from news media and if it goes against their political beliefs, forget it.
Yeah.
They think it's just fake news coming from news media. So.
Yeah, exactly. So you could say that there is also kind of a perception that fact checkers are highly liberal and highly biased.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just gonna, the right-leaning side might then think that, the checkers are essentially the equivalent of Donald Trump just calling everything fake news that we don't like. Um,
Yeah.
but most, if not all, reliable and credible fact-checking websites and organizations are really not partisan,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
they use a very kind of a very unbiased number of measures to evaluate whether or not something is likely to be false or true. There's also quite an interesting study from a couple of years ago that found that when conservatives are told that statements by Donald Trump are false, this actually does lead them to they do believe that it's false. They are kind of accepting of okay, maybe what he's saying is not true, but it doesn't change their perception of Trump or their willingness to vote for him. So even if we can kind of change people's perceptions about information, it's the buildup of all of the fake news still you know makes people have a certain perception of different sources.
Yes, and another thing that also annoys me is, I mean, and I'm very well aware of this because up till recently, I was part of several science communication and skeptic groups on Facebook, for example. Is one thing that really annoys me there is that many people, when it comes to debunking certain false claims, they usually add to the text something like, oh, people who believe these are stupid or are ignorant. And I'm like, you're not going to achieve anything positive with that. I mean, you might feel good because you're sort of signaling to your group that you don't believe in that and you think that people who believe it are stupid or something like that. But when it comes to really actually trying to convince other people, that that piece of information is false, that doesn't help at all, calling people stupid or ignorant or whatever.
No, and likely that has a backfire effect, right? And polarizes groups even more, and makes someone, just polarizes those groups even more. So that's definitely not helpful.
Yeah. So you touched on inoculation theory, and this is also something that I touched on slightly in my second interview with Dr. Sander van der Linden about his recent book, Foolproof. Could you tell us a little bit more about it? I mean, what is it based on, and how does it apply specifically to misinformation?
Yeah, so actually it's a resisting persuasion or kind of brainwashing theory from the 1960s, originally proposed by a researcher called Maguire, who suggested that basically, inducing resistance to persuasion might work in similar ways to when we immunize individuals against viral attacks, and that similar mechanisms might be at play. Um, Basically indicating that by exposing people to weakened doses of misinformation or misleading strategies, and combining that with a threat element and kind of reminding them that they need to be kind of mentally prepared, a bit like, um, when the immune system is triggered. Um, this can
Yeah, the
actually.
analogy here would be with the immune system and vaccination, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's basically, a psychological vaccine using similar strategies to when we immunize the body against viral attacks, and that we can do this in a similar way, but with the mind, to create mental antibodies against misinformation.
And so there are fact-based and technique-based inoculations. What's the difference there?
So fact-based ones will mainly, uh, let's say, teach people or train people to spot specific misleading facts. So this could be, for example, in a study on inoculating against misinformation about climate change. The fact-based ones will then, both forewarn individuals of an impending persuasive attack, at the same time with providing them with the specific factual information that's going to pre-bunk the claims they will later be exposed to. So this could be, for example, the scientific consensus. So saying, just so you know, no matter what you're going to see in the future, we do know that 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening. So when you're then later exposed to, for example, the Oregon petition, which suggests that there's hundreds of signatures from scientists that say climate change is not real, you kind of evaluate that in a different light, given that you've been presented with the true facts before. You do have to combine it with the threat element, because otherwise you're just providing them with the facts. And we do know that, uh, telling people or forewarning people, combining it with facts is superior to just giving them the facts. However, of course, it's really difficult to inoculate against every fact, like every piece of misinformation that people are going to be exposed to. I mean, you can only really do it with like the big things, like climate change misinformation and things like that. So that's where technique-based inoculations come in, where instead of inoculation against specific facts, we train individuals to spot the underlying techniques used in misinformation, so that they can spot flawed and misleading arguments and headlines, which then instead applies to a multitude of areas, making them much more powerful inoculation treatments for individuals.
And so when it comes to how we apply or should apply these two different kinds of inoculations, is it that, one of them works better than the other, or should we use them at the same time and they sort of complement each other?
So I think the last one for sure, because fact-based ones work a bit more locally, and they probably work better for very specific forms of misinformation. However, they're just really difficult to kind of translate and kind of as I said, you just can't inoculate people against all misleading information. So therefore, I do think they need to be combined with the technique-based ones, because I do think that as I said in the beginning, information doesn't need to be completely false to be misleading. And if we can instead get people to reason more correctly about, the underlying deceptiveness of a message, they'll be much better able to spot misleading information from various different sources on various different topics. And this is really what we want. We don't want to tell people really what's false. We want them to be better able to see what's misleading and not in general.
Okay, so one last topic / question then. So how effective is inoculation against misinformation? What do we know about it at this point?
So if you kind of look at general social interventions, inoculation is up there as one of the ones that has like a really, really good effect size. So when we talk like scientific levels and measures of effect size, we have some quite positive evidence that inoculation does work, especially for the ones who are kind of most susceptible. That being said, it's difficult to inoculate the whole world. And a lot of the evidence we currently have is from people who are kind of either willing to participate in scientific studies or who are willing to kind of learn more about misinformation. The problem is, getting people who are really susceptible, who are, not wanting to learn about misinformation, especially not from liberal academics, to be inoculated, because those are the people we really would want to get to. I've also in my work looked a lot at what happens when inoculation occurs in the real social world, where we're also exposed to, as I said in the beginning, misinformation from sources that we really trust, or misinformation in a context in which we see everyone else believing it as well. Do inoculation treatments still work? So one of my recent studies that's not yet published, we basically looked at whether we can inoculate people against misinformation from in-group sources. So for example, can we inoculate a conservative against misinformation from a conservative source, and likewise for liberals. And my initial hypothesis was I was a bit skeptical about it. I thought, maybe these treatments will work less well. But actually, we find the opposite, that inoculation works especially well against misinformation from in-group sources, likely because we are just more susceptible to that in the beginning. So teaching people about these misleading underlying strategies is more helpful for especially that type of misinformation because it's so persuasive. So we're better able to move people. Compared to, misinformation from out-group sources, which we already don't believe. We're already pretty good at saying, that's not true when I don't like the source,
So,
yeah.
yeah, so would you like to tell people more about the work you're doing at the moment, the kinds of things you're working on for your PhD?
Sure. So yeah, in my PhD, I'm looking at, how social context in general influences people in relation to misinformation. So the social context includes both like social cues that we are exposed to. So, if we are exposed to the different sources we're exposed to, but also the kind of general social cues. So this could be, surrounding social media cues like likes and comments. How does what the comments say underneath a headline influence whether or not we perceive it to be true? It could also be how do our perceptions of what other people believe influence whether we believe misinformation? So for example, in some of my studies, I expose people to information about other participants saying like, everyone else believes this. Here's the headline, what do you think? And we kind of test whether or not those judgments affect people. And then I integrate this work with inoculation theories to kind of make them more robust, to test whether, given what we know about the context, can we still inoculate people within that context? In future work, for example, I'm going to be a storytelling fellow at University Arts London for the last year of my PhD, where I'll be looking at the impact of social interactions. So kind of, we are actually having an interactive moment right here. How does, real social interaction influence our susceptibility to misinformation? Because current work really does mainly use either experimental methods, so we expose people to like static social information, or computational online methods where we can, look at real social behavior, but we can't establish causality. So I would like to kind of combine the two.
So trying to move more from a lab setting to a real world setting. Right.
Yeah, exactly, and kind of examining how when people actually interact, what happens if they could either be, people actually interacting online or actually interacting in person.
Great. So would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
So I have my website, ceciliatraberg.com. That's where kind of most of my work is. Also on my Google Scholar page, that's my actual kind of publications. And there's also a little bit of stuff on me on the Social Decision Making Lab website, if people are interested.
Great. So I'm leaving links in the description box to all of that. And Cecilia, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. Best of luck with your PhD, and it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for the really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Per Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Francis Ford, Tiago Dunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Meira, Tam Amal, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eklund, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Holt Erigbud, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Gelbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.